Hello, everybody, and welcome to GED Live with the GED Testing Service and Kaplan Test Prep. My name is Arthur Ahn, and it is my pleasure to be with you for this lesson on demand video recording of our GED Live session on scientific experiments. We've got a lot of information here about how to best handle those questions that you'll see on the GED Science test, specifically related to scientific experiments. So let's get started. What we're going to look at are a couple things that are related to understanding how scientific experiments work. So we see our 6 learning objectives for this session. And the first is going to be how to look at scientific models and theories. Then we're going to be looking at scientific experiments and whether they adhere to the scientific method for experiments. So, of course, in order to know if an experiment follows the scientific method, we'll also look at what the scientific method is. Thirdly, we'll be looking at hypotheses for scientific investigation. Like, what is a hypothesis and how is that related to scientific experiment? Then we'll look at independent and dependent variables, differentiating what they are so that it helps you take on that scientific mentality to help answer more GED science questions. Understanding the strengths and weaknesses in the design of a scientific investigation. How did they conduct the experiment? Is the experiment legitimate? Maybe there are some errors in the experiment itself. And then lastly, conclusions and predictions are either supported or challenged by data or evidence. Here we're going to see whether we can say, oh, this prediction actually makes sense, or this conclusion is valid. Got a lot to look at here today, so let's get started with our first topic here. And in general, it's about the whole mentality on the GED Science test is simply saying this: are you able to think like a scientist? It's not about how much scientific knowledge that you've memorized. In fact, what you see here is a few things. One is that the GED Science test questions use text, graphics, or a combination of the two. So the text or the graphics will give you the information needed to answer a question. Now again, these texts and graphics will relate to life science, physical science, earth science, space science. But again, there's not about the specific content knowledge. The questions are designed to test more on scientific reasoning. Yes, there'll be some basic scientific content knowledge that you'll need, but it's not the most complex scientific knowledge. In fact, at the high school level, there's tons of scientific knowledge that a lot of people know at the high school level. But honestly, the GED Science test is more about the reasoning behind the information. In fact, our main point is this: thinking like a scientist rather than trying to memorize all these advanced scientific facts. Thinking like a scientist is the key to success on the GED Science test. So with that, how do we think like a scientist? Well, understanding how scientific models work is a big part of that. So let's dive in here. Scientific models are used to describe objects, phenomenon, or processes. Scientific models can be either visual or material or mathematical. They'll focus on the most important ideas, ignoring some of the other stuff, and instead highlighting relevant characteristics, thinking about, again, the most important key information. A scientific theory is an account of the world which is supported by repeated observations, experiments, and facts. Scientific theories, big note here, is that they're not guesses, they're not hunches. Scientific theories are conclusions that are based on evidence. Okay? And these theories can sometimes change because as scientists get new evidence, it may prove other things or may displace older theories, and then the scientists will replace them with new theories. So scientific theories are not really guesses at all. They're just simply conclusions that are based on evidence that is given. And the scientific method can be applied by using these 5 steps. One is this: observe a phenomenon and create a question about it. Like if you've ever looked in the sky, you're like, hey, how do those stars move? Like, that's literally the question. You're observing something and you're creating a question about it. Then secondly, form a hypothesis. Think, okay, the question that I asked myself, I think this is the answer. That's what a hypothesis essentially is. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit. Thirdly, after you form that hypothesis, you're going to want to conduct the experiment to test the hypothesis and collect and analyze data about that phenomenon you're studying. And lastly, form a conclusion or make a prediction about it. Okay, so basically, once you've collected the data, you can say, oh, this is the conclusion we can make. This is the prediction we can make about this scientific topic. We mentioned the word phenomenon a few moments ago, and you see the definition here. A phenomenon is an observable event. Scientists are constantly working to discover and explain new phenomena, which is simply the plural, more than one phenomenon, through their work. So phenomenon sounds like a very complex word and must be about these random things out there. But honestly, we see a lot of examples of scientific phenomenon in our daily lives, as well as some more glamorous phenomena, if you will. So for instance, examples like auroras. If you've ever heard of like the aurora borealis, or maybe something referred to as the northern lights, they're these little light shows in the sky at certain times of the year in specific locations. The light shows are most easily seen near the North and the South Pole. So if you've ever lived in like one of the more northern areas, like for instance Alaska or maybe some of the northern European countries, they often say that every year or every few years they're able to see these light shows in the night sky. So it's actually quite beautiful to see them. So an aurora is an example of a scientific phenomenon. But if you're thinking, well, that's a really complex phenomenon, here's another phenomenon that you're actually used to in everyday life. Gravity. Gravity is a phenomenon. And in fact, the theory about gravity is that as objects attract each other, the larger the object, the stronger the pull. Like what keeps us glued to the Earth? It's that the Earth, being a much larger object than any of us, is pulling us towards itself. So that's a scientific phenomenon. Gravity, basically, the idea that we're not floating off into space at any given moment, that we are staying on the Earth. And thirdly, another example phenomenon is lake effect snow. If you've ever lived in the Great Lakes areas, Western New York or the northern parts of the Midwest, like Michigan, for instance, if you live near any of the Great Lakes, you've probably noticed that in the winters you get this thing called lake effect snow. Sometimes you hear those on the TV weather reports. And lake effect snow is that says that near lakes there are higher amounts of snow caused by weather patterns specifically around that lake. It's really, I actually went to school in the Western New York area, and I noticed it every winter when people further away from the Great Lakes would say, "Oh, we only got like a few inches of snow." We would get literally 2 feet of snow, and then so this is a real thing called lake effect snow that can happen around specific areas around lakes in particular. So these are examples of scientific phenomena, an observable event. Now, a hypothesis is a prediction that's used to explain the phenomenon. So once you've observed a phenomenon and you've asked yourself a question about that phenomenon, the next step is the hypothesis, making a prediction that you think would explain how that phenomenon works. Now, a hypothesis is essentially an educated guess. An educated guess simply because it hasn't been tested yet. Now, when you see these in GED Science passages, the hypothesis is almost always going to be the main idea of a paragraph or the main idea of the passage overall. So look for that hypothesis. Look for what the scientist is saying as the educated guess to explain the phenomenon. If the results of that experiment, after they've done the experiment, they've collected their data, if the results don't match the hypothesis, scientists will revise the hypothesis. They'll come up with a new educated guess to include new information or understand the phenomenon. And as any good scientist will say, they'll run that experiment many, many, many times because you don't want to just go by the first results, right? You want to make sure that the hypothesis that you came up with is actually true, not just because of some fluke error, but rather because you want to ensure that the hypothesis is correct. So let's take a look at our first example of a question here. What I'd like you to do is pause the video, and after you pause the video, try this question on your own, give yourself a minute or so, and then once you have an answer, unpause the video, and we'll go over this one together. Okay, let's take a look at question number 1. It's asking for the horizontal axis. What does the horizontal axis represent? In fact, we see that horizontal axis represented way down here in this graph about endothermic reaction. So one thing to notice is this, even before we get to the answer. The axis is almost always going to represent something to do with the process of something. So if you notice, there are 2 answer choices that we can immediately eliminate because we're looking for something saying about time, and choices A and B don't represent, don't say time. They say a certain specific time, the instant that the reaction starts or the instant that the reaction stops. But the axis overall, that whole stretched out horizontal axis, is not going to represent one particular moment. It's going to represent an entire stretch of moments. So we can certainly get rid of choices A and B. And then out of those 2 remaining choices, the correct answer, of course, is going to be the answer that indicates time. And that's going to be answer choice C, the time during which the reaction occurs. Now, one quick note here, if you take a look at choice D mentions the energy level in the reaction. Well, the energy level in the reaction is measured on this graph. But notice how this is about the y-axis rather than the x-axis. So that's how we know we can eliminate choice D. Your correct answer is going to be choice C, the time during which the reaction occurs. All right, great work on this question. Now let's take a look at another example. This one's going to be a little bit longer, so I would recommend if you have a timer nearby, give yourself about 2 minutes to try this question on your own. So set up that timer for 2 minutes. Once you start the timer, pause the video, try this question on your own, and then after you have an answer, unpause the video, and we'll go over this one together. Okay, one big thing to look for in these questions on GED Science, on the GED Science test that deal with passages, is that when you have this long paragraph of information, you might have noticed it. We have a lot of information in this paragraph. Rather than starting with the paragraph, start with the actual question itself. Which one of the following, if true, makes the scientist's conclusion more likely? So as you see that word conclusion, that will actually be really helpful to think, okay, now that I've read the question, I know I'm looking something to do with making the scientist's conclusion more likely. Well, as I'm reading it, the first thing I'm going to look for is the conclusion. And what is that conclusion in this paragraph? Well, you probably noticed it when you read through it. That second sentence in that paragraph says one scientist has concluded. Now, what has the scientist concluded? The explosion in the Guam spider population is due to an increase in the population of invasive species of brown tree snake. So we see there's an increase in the population of brown tree snake. So what can we, how can we paraphrase this a little bit? The population of snakes has gone up. Now, what else does this paragraph say? This paragraph mentions that the brown tree snake preys on birds. Well, wait a minute. If there are more snakes and the snakes prey on birds, well, then that's probably going to mean that the birds, what's going to happen to these birds? The bird population is going to go down, right? Because because if there are more snakes out there and the snakes prey on birds, or they go after birds, they use birds as a source of food, well, the bird population is going to go down. But what else did they mention here to support this hypothesis? That the spider population has exploded. So wait a minute, the bird population's gone down, but now the spider population's also gone way up. So if the spider population's gone way up, which of those choices is going to make our conclusion most likely? Well, if the spider population's gone up at the same time the bird population's going down, well, maybe there aren't enough birds to go after all these spiders. Like, which of those choices makes this connection about the bird population going down and the spider population going up? And that's going to be answer choice A. The birds that the brown tree snake eats are the primary predators of spiders on Guam. Great work on this question. Let's take a look at our next scientific topic here, or a scientific exercise here. We're going to take a look at a passage and a couple of questions that are attached to this. So I'm going to give you about 15 seconds just to read this paragraph on your own. And then as you read that, you don't have to pause the video. I'll just stay quiet for 15 seconds. See if you can summarize this paragraph into one general topic in this paragraph. Go ahead and do that now. So we see here it says the forelimbs of humans, penguins, birds that fly, and alligators are similar. The similar pattern of the bones is evidence that these animals evolved from a common ancestor. All this other stuff here, but notice towards the end they bring up the main point. They're defining for us what a homologous structure is, or when creatures are homologous, they have similar structures. So they're giving us this list of humans, penguins, birds that fly, and alligators as examples of homologous organisms, basically organisms that have similar structures. And then we see this diagram here of homologous structures with the human arm, the penguin's flipper, the bird's wing, and the alligator's leg. And again, don't sit there and try to memorize all this stuff about the carpals and the radius and the humerus and the ulna of the human's arm and the penguin's flipper and the bird's wing and the alligator's leg. No, don't waste time doing that. Instead, what is the point of this diagram? What is the point of this illustration? Simply this. Just to give us some examples of how these are homologous structures. We see the similarity in those structures. Now let's take a look at the questions. Give you a few moments to take a look at question number 3. Pause the video, try this question on your own, and then when you're done, you have an answer, unpause the video, and we'll go over this together. All right, let's take a look at question number 3 here. They mentioned the forelimbs of frogs are homologous to those of human arms, penguin flippers, bird wings, and alligator legs. Based on the diagram and paragraph, which of the following is likely to be true of frogs' forelimbs? So if the forelimbs of frogs are homologous to all those other things that we just saw, what has to be true? They must have something to do with the same structure. And if we see here in the human arm and the penguin flipper and the bird wing and the alligator leg, notice how they all have the same types of bones, the carpals and the radius and the humerus and the ulna. So which of those choices indicates some similarity with the frog's forelimbs and all of these other homologous structures that are given here? The correct answer is going to be answer choice B. Frogs' forelimbs must contain carpal bones if they're going to be homologous. Nicely done. Let's take a look now at question number 4. Give yourself a few moments to try this question on your own by pausing the video. Attempt this one on your own, and then when you have an answer, unpause the video, and we'll go over this one together. Which of the following statements is supported by the paragraph and diagram? If you can notice here, what do we see here? That all these homologous structures with all these 4 different all 4 of these structures have the same bone structure, have the same types of bones. But if you notice here, again, the big thing to note here is how they're similar, but we have some differences here. Notice here we have the human arm, whereas for the penguin, they mentioned the flipper. Whereas for the bird, they mentioned the wing. Whereas for the alligator, they mentioned the leg. Very different types of structures we have. So even though they have similar structure, like how you'd use them, the human arm would be used very differently than for a flipper, than for a wing, than for a leg. An arm would be used very differently than for a leg. An alligator's leg would be a leg would be used to move the animal across land, whereas a wing would be used to get air so that they can fly. So which of those choices is going to do that? Well, if you take a look at those choices, we can go through these choices using process of elimination. In choice A, the tip of a bird's wing is homologous to the upper arm of the human. Is that true? If we look at the bird's wing, the tip of the bird's wing would be right around there. Is that going to be homologous to the upper arm of the human? No, so we can certainly get rid of answer choice A. Now, choice B says penguins are more closely related to humans than they are to birds. Now, be careful. You may be tempted to say, oh, the penguin's flipper and the human arm look very similar. Certainly more similar than a bird's wing. However, notice what choice B is saying. Choice B says that penguins are more closely related to humans than they are to birds. We don't know that from the paragraph and the diagram, so therefore we can eliminate answer choice B. But then if we take a look at answer choice C, in penguins, flying birds, humans, and alligators, the forelimbs have similar structures despite performing different functions. That's going to be true, right? We know they're homologous, so they're going to have similar structures, but they're going to have different functions. And C is going to be your correct answer for this. All right, great work on this one. Now let's take a look at our next category, our next topic that deals with scientific variables. A variable is something that can be changed within an experiment. So there are different types of variables. We want to break those down a little bit. Control variables are the parts of the experiment that scientists will keep the same. Scientists will conduct experiments to understand the relationships between the variables. So you want to make sure that you have control variables. Like if everything changes, there's no way to make effective conclusions. So you always want to ask yourself, what is the same between the groups or the studies or the different experiments? That's going to be the control variables. So why do scientists need to think about control variables in their experimental designs? Controls will give the baselines. So if you have baselines, you're able to make comparisons more effectively and develop stronger conclusions. Now, independent variables are the factors that are intentionally changed during an experiment. And for a really well-designed experiment, there should never be more than one independent variable per hypothesis. So if you have a hypothesis, oh, I think this is what's going to happen, change one variable to see if that hypothesis is true. Now, when you're trying to identify an independent variable, ask yourself, what's the purpose of the experiment? What's the x-axis of the graph or the first column of any table? Whereas a dependent variable is what changed because of the change in the independent variable. For example, if a scientist increased the temperature, then the color of the liquid became darker. The temperature change would be the independent variable. That's the thing that the scientist changed intentionally. The color of the liquid would be the dependent variable. That's the thing that changed because of the independent variable change. So experiments can have one or more dependent variables. So for instance, if you change the temperature, maybe a lot of different things are going to happen, right? So it is possible to have more than one dependent variable. So when you're trying to identify what the dependent variable is for an experiment, ask yourself, and what happens when the scientists change the independent variable? And what is the y-axis on the graph or the other columns of any tables? That information is going to indicate the dependent variable. All right, so let's take a look at an example of a passage here. Okay, so we'll go through this together and break this down. We have an office manager here noticing each time she touches the metal filing cabinet next to her desk, she experienced an electrostatic shock, commonly known as static electricity. Her assistant only rarely experienced such shocks when touching the cabinet. The office manager wondered why this might be. So already we're seeing that initial phenomenon, right, about static electricity, and the office manager is wondering, why is it that when the office manager touches the cabinet, she experiences shock, but the assistant does not? So we've seen that first paragraph, a phenomenon and a question. The question is, why am I getting shocked as opposed to the assistant getting shocked? So in the second paragraph, we see in that very first line in the second paragraph says the office manager developed a hypothesis. So there's our hypothesis. Perhaps differences in clothing could explain why she was experiencing more shocks than her assistant. So notice here, it's our educated guess that the office manager is making. The educated guess is, oh, it's the type of clothing that's causing more shocks. The office manager liked to wear nylon clothing, and her assistant usually wore other types of clothing. So different clothing might account for the different number of shocks. So her assistant usually wore cotton clothing. So now we see the next part here. We're going to test the hypothesis. The office manager convinced her assistant to wear nylon clothing to work every day for a week, while she herself wore cotton clothing. So we're seeing already the experiment happening here, right? How's this experiment happening? 1 week, the office manager is convincing her assistant to wear nylon. She herself is wearing cotton. Then next week, they switch. Then after that, to control for the possibility that the differences in shocks were due to differences in their footwear, they wore identical shoes every day. Notice how the identical shoes, that's going to be our control factor, right? That's the thing that's not going to change. So if we break this down, the independent variable is going to be the different material, nylon versus cotton. The control is going to be the keeping the same type of shoes. They wore identical shoes each day. During the experiment, both the office manager and her assistant recorded the number of times they experienced shock. So then that is going to be our data, right? So just simply recording the number of times they got shocked is going to be the data. And they also record the number of times they experienced electrostatic shocks when doing so. So the number of times they touched the filing cabinet and the number of shocks that they received. So notice here, our dependent variable, what's going to change because of the different types of clothing? The number of shocks, how often they get shocked. So then from there, we see the results of this experiment. At the end of the first week, they found the assistant had experienced 73 electrostatic shocks, while the office manager experienced 10. During the second week, the office manager experienced 68 shocks and her assistant 12. So notice, wait a minute, what's going on here? That first week, the assistant got shocked more. During the second week, the office manager got shocked more. And notice that difference is huge, right? A lot more. 73 versus 10, 68 versus 12. So we see here our results from this experiment. And from those results, we see the conclusion. The manager concluded that these results supported her hypothesis, and as a result, she decided to switch to mostly cotton clothing. So this is our experiment, using the scientific method to create an experiment. Now let's take a look at a couple of questions that follow from this. Again, you can use our summaries that we've come up with from this passage to try question number 5. Pause the video, give yourself a minute to try this one on your own, and when you have an answer, unpause the video, and we'll go over this one together. All right, number 5 says, which piece of evidence from the passage supports the theory that differences in clothing were causing the shocks? Which piece of evidence is actually giving that? Well, notice, what's the evidence that's supporting the theory different clothing causing shocks? Well, what evidence was there to show that, oh, it must be the clothing? Well, when a certain type of clothing was worn, they experienced a different number of shocks, right? So basically, we're looking here at what happened during the experiments, right? When the assistant wore nylon, she got shocked more often than when the manager was wearing cotton. Which answer choice matches that? That's going to be answer choice A. When the assistant wore nylon, she experienced more shocks than the manager did while wearing cotton. Great work on this one, folks. All right, let's take a look at our next example here, dealing with strengths and weaknesses in experiments. Now, you want your experiments to be strong. And by strong, we mean that they're logically valid. They're going to give us good conclusions. Strong experiments are designed to allow inferences to be drawn about a population from sample data collected in an experiment. Strong experiments control most parts of the experiment to mimic natural environments, and they use sample groups that are representative of the larger population in question. So you want the samples to be representative. You don't want the samples to be slanted. You want the samples to be fair, to represent the larger population. Strong experiments will also measure both independent and dependent variables accurately, and strong experiments will run multiple studies to understand a phenomenon. Rather than trying to do the experiment just once and getting an answer based on that, they'll run that experiment multiple times to make sure that they fully understand what that phenomenon is. And lastly, that in a strong experiment, they manipulate only one independent variable per experiment. Now, weak experiments may have errors in the design. Sources of error can be, for instance, if there's no control. There's no control variables or control group. Maybe the equipment was faulty. Maybe the variables aren't measured accurately. Maybe there's just some random error attached to those. So when you're looking at questions that are asking you to find the errors or the weaknesses in the experiment, identify the type of error in your own words. Like, put it in your own words first before looking at the answer choices. Then see if there's some way to modify the experiment to improve it, and think like a scientist planning an experiment. Like, if I was planning this experiment, how would I have changed this? What would I have done to make sure my data is going to be strong? And then conclusion is the result of the scientist's investigation. Like, what did they learn from this investigation? Conclusions must be supported by evidence to be valid. They are sometimes only partially supported or completely unsupported by the results of an experiment. So if the evidence doesn't support the conclusion, it's not the evidence that's bad, it's the conclusion that's bad. A prediction is what a scientist thinks will happen in the future. Predictions are based on trends in the data and results of experiments. So when you're looking at experiment's conclusion, if you're trying to evaluate what is the conclusion here, or is this conclusion valid, ask yourself a couple things. One, what was the purpose and hypothesis of the experiment at the beginning? Was the experiment designed well? Did the data and results support or refute the hypothesis? Do the predictions match the trends in the data? Basically saying, okay, if I'm looking at this conclusion, is this conclusion valid? So let's take a look at an example here of some practice questions dealing with all these different topics that we've looked at so far. Give yourself about a minute to try this question on your own. Pause the video. Try this question on your own. When you have an answer, unpause the video, and we'll go over this one together. So let's take a look at number 6 together. Again, notice we're going to start with what the question itself is asking for. In which of the following places is geothermal energy most likely to be used? So as we're reading this, we're going to be looking for how we can make a conclusion here about where geothermal energy would be used. We see that geothermal energy is energy extracted from naturally occurring steam, hot water, or hot rocks in the Earth's crust. It's used to heat buildings and generate electricity in areas where hot magma, melted rock, is close to the surface. So what can we already say about geothermal energy and where it's going to be used? It's going to be used where there's melted rock. Where do we see in those answer choices a location that's using melted rock? And that is going to be answer choice C, where they mention Iceland is an island nation in the Atlantic with active volcanoes. Active volcanoes would be where we would see hot magma or melted rock. And C is your correct answer. Great work on this one. Let's take a look at another question here. Give you about a minute to try this one on your own. Again, pause the video, give yourself a minute, and after you have an answer, unpause the video, and we'll go over this one together. Okay, let's take a look at number 7. For which of the following hypotheses does the chart provide evidence? And for something like this, we first want to take a look at the chart, which mentions layers of the atmosphere. And notice they're mentioning the different layers here, 4 different types of layers. And then there are 2 factors that are being measured here, the altitude and the temperature. So let's use process of elimination here to go through the answer choices. Choice A says the higher you go in the atmosphere, the colder it gets. Well, at first, this actually looks pretty good. We're starting in the troposphere. And in the troposphere, the altitude is 0 to 6 miles. And the average temperature is about 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Then we're in the stratosphere. Stratosphere is the next layer up. So we're going higher in the stratosphere. And notice that temperature range goes down, -76 to +32. So far, so good. Then we see the mesosphere and ionosphere going higher up in the altitude. And again, notice that temperature, again, is going down. It's getting colder. 32 degrees Fahrenheit to -212 degrees Fahrenheit. So far, so good. But wait a minute. Take a look at that last layer. The thermosphere. Thermosphere is the highest level. And notice what happens in the temperature in the thermosphere. All of a sudden, it goes dramatically upward, up to thousands of degrees. So is that true that higher you go up in the atmosphere, the colder it gets? Not the whole time, because once you get to the thermosphere, it goes it gets much, much, much hotter. We can eliminate answer choice A. Now, choice B says the higher you go in the atmosphere, the less oxygen there is to breathe. Be careful. What does choice B mention that's never talked about? It's that word oxygen. We're never measuring how much oxygen there is to breathe, so we can eliminate choice B. Choice C says the highest level of the atmosphere is the stratosphere. Is that true? No, the highest level, the highest layer of the atmosphere is not going to be the stratosphere. We see it's the thermosphere. So we can get rid of choice C as well, and therefore our correct answer is going to be answer choice D. The highest temperatures are in the thermosphere, which we saw earlier. The thermosphere goes up to thousands of degrees, so clearly we do not want to be in the thermosphere unless we want to get burned. Choice D is going to be our answer for this. Highest temperatures in the atmosphere are in the thermosphere. All right, now let's try question number 8. Again, pause the video. Give yourself a minute to try this one on your own, and when you have an answer, unpause the video, and we'll go over this one together. And again, we're going to start with our initial question here. Why does Ben have insufficient proof for his conclusion? So as we're reading this, we're thinking about, okay, we're looking for the place where we see this experiment might have gone wrong. The proof, there's not enough proof here. Ben set up an experiment to prove that ivy plants take in water through their roots. He took a jar, put an ivy plant in the open jar, and filled the jar with water to cover only the roots of the ivy. After a week, he checked the water level in the jar and found it had gone down. Ben concluded that the plant had absorbed water through its roots. So at first, on the surface, looks like it kind of makes sense, right? Put an ivy plant in a jar, fill the jar with water. After a week, the level of water has gone down. Oh, the plant absorbed the water. But wait a minute. Does that have to be true based on this experiment? The insufficient proof is that we don't know if it's only the plant that absorbed the water. Maybe something else absorbed the water. Maybe there's some other reason why the water level might have decreased. That's what we're looking for here. An answer choice that might give us a reason why the water level might have decreased instead of just the plant absorbing the water through its roots. Which of those choices gives you that? And that's going to be choice C. The water level in the jar might have gone down because of evaporation. C is your answer. We need something to indicate that there's some other reason why the water level might have gone down. Maybe because of evaporation, maybe because Ben's pet dog started drinking out of the jar with the plant, and it's something to indicate that water level might have gone down for other legitimate reasons. Great work on this one. Let's take a look at our next example here. Take a look at question number 9. Give yourself a minute to try this one on your own, and when you have an answer, we'll go over this one together. Now, pause the video, give yourself a minute, and then unpause the video, and again, we'll go over this together. Okay, so question number 9 is asking us this. Which of the following is a theory rather than a fact? And I'm going to highlight that big word there saying theory. Remember, facts are things that can be verified. Which of those choices cannot be verified? The correct answer here is going to be answer choice B. A single large mass called whatever that is pronounced, exists about 250 million years ago. Again, that's something that we can't actually verify because they're saying it happened 250 million years ago. All of those other things can be verified, right? The San Andreas Fault is the boundary between North America and the Pacific plates. The Earth's crust is composed of rocks like granite, basalt, and gabbro. Earthquakes often occur along tectonic plate boundaries. Those are all facts rather than theories. The only answer choice that's a theory here is going to be choice B. Great work here. All right. Now let's take a look at question number 10. Let's actually spend a few moments to try this one together. Suppose that you notice your right knee hurts every time you play softball. You suspect that one of the movements involved in playing softball is causing your knee to hurt, but you're not sure which movement is the culprit. You decide to do a scientific investigation to find out more. Match each of the following steps of the scientific method with a phase of your investigation, and we'll look at the list in a second here, but notice what we're trying to do is we're going to match up the 4 different statements to see which one is forming a hypothesis, which one is designing a test for the hypothesis, which one's collecting data to test the hypothesis, and which one is forming a conclusion based on the data from the test itself. So now give yourself about 2 minutes for this one to try this one on your own. See which of those statements match up with each individual box. On the GED Science exam, you take your cursor and click and basically do a drag. You drag the box to which one is for A, which one's for B, which one's for C, which one's for D. For now, you don't have to do that, obviously, but just take about 2 minutes to read through each of those and see if you can match which one of those statements matches up with each step of the scientific process. Give you about 2 minutes. Pause the video, give yourself 2 minutes for this, and after that, we'll go over this together. Okay, let's take a look. The first one is to form a hypothesis. Which of those statements is forming a hypothesis? Remember, a hypothesis is an educated guess on the question itself. The question, if you remember, was about the knee pain, like the phenomena about that, right? What's causing the knee pain? Which of those statements is going to be our educated guess, our hypothesis? And notice here, we have it in that statement over there. You make a guess about which of the movements involved in playing softball puts the greatest stress on the knees. You suspect it may be stopping suddenly after running a short distance. So you would match letter A with that particular statement. Now we want to look at the statement that's indicating how the test is being designed. How are we designing this test? Well, we see here a couple of keywords: making a list, planning to perform each movement several times. There's our test, so that's going to be our statement to match that. Then let's take a look at the next one. Which of those statements is collecting data to test the hypothesis? Well, we see a keyword in this statement about recording how the knee feels, letting your knee recover between those different tests. So that's going to be the box to indicate collecting data. And then by process of elimination, I think we already know the last one, forming a conclusion based on the data from your test. Which one of those remaining statements is the conclusion? It is likely that stopping suddenly after running a short distance is indeed the cause of the knee pain. So that's going to be the last statement. Great work on this one. So this is basically an example of understanding how the scientific theory or the scientific theory works for experiments. All right, let's take a look at question number 11. This one is going to be is an example of basically a short answer response type question. Let's take a look at this one. Farmer purchased 30 acres of farmland. The farmer calculated the average topsoil thickness on the farmland is about 20 centimeters. The farmer wants to maintain the thickness of the soil on this farmland by reducing erosion. The farmer plans to test the effectiveness of two different farming methods for reducing soil erosion. There are these two different methods. Method one, planting crops without plowing the soil. Method two, the winter cover crop, growing plants during the winter that are plowed into the soil in the spring. The farmer hypothesizes that using either method will reduce erosion compared to using traditional farming methods, plowing and no cover crop. So this short answer question will basically ask you to see if you can identify how this experiment is being designed. And for something like this, you'd actually have about 10 minutes to complete. Now, you don't need to spend all 10 minutes to try this one on your own. If you'd like, though, you can pause at this point and see if you can come up with the different steps. But let's go over this one together here. So the question itself would say, design a controlled experiment the farmer can use to test this hypothesis. Include descriptions of data collection, how the farmer will determine whether his hypothesis is correct. So here are the things that you would write out. You would type these out to show that you understand how this experiment would be designed. So first thing is simply the question. Questioning, we always want to introduce a question. And our question is this: can different farming methods reduce soil erosion? Right? That's ultimately what this farmer wants to know. How are those farming methods going to reduce soil erosion? And the hypothesis that the farmer had, if you remember, we mentioned this a few moments ago, either these newer techniques is going to reduce erosion compared to using traditional farming methods. So the experiment, well, how would we design this experiment? How would we actually show if using one of those newer methods will reduce erosion, well, there are a couple things that we can do here. First, we have our independent variable. That's going to be the farming method, right? The farming method is what the farmer is going to change. Then what's the dependent variable? Measuring the soil erosion, right? How much did the soil get eroded? And our controls. Remember, we want to also highlight what things we're keeping the same. The plant type, the water, the soil type, the fertilizer, all those stuff, those are going to be our controls. Remember, if we change any of those other controls, then we don't know if the farming method is what made the soil erosion go slower, or if it actually speeded up soil erosion. We wouldn't know if it was because of the farming method. So we want to make sure that we know what our controls are. So how would we conduct this experiment? Maybe for 1 year, we farm a certain acre of land using the traditional method. And then for next year, we'd farm the same piece of land using one of the newer methods. And the following year, we would farm the same piece of land using the other newer method. That would be our experiment. And for each month, we simply measure and record how much topsoil is left over, right? The more topsoil there is, the less erosion that happened. So then based on the experiment, the data that we would collect. Use the monthly records of topsoil for each method to determine the total changes to topsoil over the course of 1 year, right? So basically we're going to say from January to February, this much. February to March, this much. March to April, this much. Basically comparing from the previous month to see how much change in topsoil happened. And what's the conclusion? The farmer can determine whether the hypothesis is correct based on how much topsoil was lost, if any, over the course of the year. So the farmer will use the data to make a conclusion. If the traditional method results in a greater loss of topsoil than method 1 or 2, then the farmer was correct. But if the traditional method actually keeps more topsoil, right? It results in less topsoil being lost, well, then those newer methods weren't good and the hypothesis was incorrect. And you can see then the farmer would be like, well, I'm not going to use those newer methods. I'm going to stick with the traditional method. So that's what you would write out, and then you would have about 10 minutes to try this one on your own on the GED Science test, basically writing out what the hypothesis is, what the experiment is, what are the independent and dependent and control variables are, how to collect the data, and what the conclusions would be. Great work on this one. Now let's take a look at one more set of questions dealing with GED Science experiments. We'll go through this paragraph together. Imagine a substance, such as salt or sugar, dissolved in a liquid, such as water or alcohol. The liquid in which the substance is dissolved is called the solvent. Osmosis is the diffusion or movement of a solvent across a semi-permeable membrane, a barrier that allows some substances to pass through it. The solvent moves from the side of the membrane with less dissolved material to the side of the membrane with more dissolved material. The result of osmosis is an equilibrium, the state in which the rate at which the solvent flows across the membrane at the same rate in both directions. So there's a lot of stuff here, right? There's a lot of stuff that's going on here. But basically, we're just indicating here that if there's some sort of substance dissolved in a liquid, and osmosis is the movement of a solvent across some sort of membrane. So, and basically the idea behind osmosis is to create some sort of equilibrium. So osmosis basically means a balance, or the same is that the solvent flows across the membrane at the same rate in both directions. Jillian conducts an experiment to see how quickly various liquids and a specific amount of sugar dissolved in them would undergo osmosis. She used vats of the same size with semi-permeable membranes, separating one size of the vat from the other, and she put equal amounts of various liquids in both sides. So notice here we have this container used for studying osmosis. That squiggly line in the middle is our semi-permeable membrane, and we have side A and B of this container. And our experiment is to see the speed of osmosis of different liquids, of various liquids in both sides. So then from here, let's take a look at question number 12. Jillian used one of the vats to test the rate of diffusion of liquid acetone in the process of osmosis. What did she most likely put in the two sides of the semi-permeable membrane of the vat? Give you a minute to try this one on your own. Pause the video, give yourself 1 minute. When you have an answer, unpause the video, and we'll go over this one together. Okay, so we want to see which of those choices is going to indicate what she put in the two sides of the membrane of the vat. Well, what should actually change here? What should change is the sugar. But what's going to stay the same? What's going to stay the same is the liquid acetone. How much actual acetone is there? Which of those choices is going to indicate that? Where one side is going to have sugar and one side is going to have liquid acetone, and that's going to be answer choice C. Pure acetone on one side, a solution of sugar on the other. That way, Jillian will be able to measure the rate of diffusion. Like those other answer choices, if you look at answer choices B and D, for instance, they say the same thing, right? Choice B says 50% on one side, 50% on the other side. Well, then if they're the exact same thing on side A and B, nothing's going to move, right? Nothing's going to move across the membrane. Choice D, if you put pure acetone on one side and pure acetone on the other side, again, nothing's going to change. So we can eliminate choices B and D. And then choice A says pure acetone on one side, and then notice what side B says for choice A. Sugar in a glass container. Well, if we put the sugar in a glass container, that sugar is not going to leave the container, right? Even if the sugar container, even if the glass container is submerged in acetone, that's not going to measure any movement across the membrane. So choice C is going to be your correct answer. One side you put just acetone, the other side you put a solution of sugar and acetone, and you'll be able to measure the sugar moving over, with the acetone. All right, let's try number 13. Give you a minute to try this one on your own. Pause the video, and when you have an answer, unpause the video, and we'll go over this one together. Okay, if you take a look at number 13, Jillian's experiment yielded the results shown in the table. Based on this information, which solvent had the highest rate of diffusion? Here's where you want to be careful. If something has the highest rate of diffusion, if it diffused at the highest rate, what would that be true? What would be true about the time that it took? The time would actually be not the biggest, but the smallest amount of time. The highest rate is going to be the fastest. So which of those answer choices indicating the fastest time to reach equilibrium? That would be the smallest amount of time would be the fastest time. And that's going to be answer choice D. Formic acid took only 15 minutes to reach equilibrium. All those other solvents took more time to reach equilibrium. All right, and our final question for this lesson, take a look at number 14. By the way, if you see that note there towards the bottom right corner, it says on test A, click on select. So this is what's called where like you'd have a blank here, but you'd click on a drop down arrow to indicate which and then once you click on that drop down menu, you'd see those 4 answer choices. But for now, try this question on your own, give yourself a minute, and after that, we'll go over this one together. Okay, so again, start with the question itself. Based on the information above, your tissues would begin to lose water and dry out when your body has a level of dissolved material related how to your body's tissues. And then we see that paragraph, they talk about osmosis is the reason why it's unhealthy and potentially dangerous to drink seawater. If you drink seawater, which contains a high concentration of salts and other dissolved material, some of that dissolved material will be absorbed into your bloodstream, causing your blood to have a higher than normal concentration of dissolved material. As that blood circulates through your body, water will move from your body tissues into your blood vessels, causing your tissue to lose water and dry out. So the question says your tissues will begin to lose water and dry out when your blood has a level of dissolved material, how related to your body's tissues. So in this one we see here, we can go back to the passage. What else is happening when your tissues lose water and dry out? We see that towards the last part of the sentence, towards the last sentence. As that blood circulates through your body, water will move from your body's tissues into your blood vessels. So how's that going to be related about your blood having a level of dissolved material and with that of your body's tissues? That's going to be choice A. The blood has a level of dissolved material greater than that of your body's tissues. Therefore, your tissues will lose water, again, through osmosis. Choice A is going to be a correct answer for that. Great work on this lesson, folks, dealing with scientific experiments. Just as a quick review here, that now that we've completed this lesson, you should be better able to accomplish those things that we listed out here earlier. Analyzing scientific models and theories, determining whether an experiment adheres to the scientific methods for experiments, formulating hypotheses for scientific investigations, identifying independent and dependent variables, identifying the strengths and weaknesses in the design of a scientific investigation, and determining whether conclusions and predictions are supported or challenged by data or evidence. To remember that effort and practice are the big keys to test day success. You should reinforce these topics that we've looked at tonight by completing practice questions. And during the course of your GED Science test studies, if you have any questions between watching the recordings or attending any of our GED live sessions, you can always email us.